Hello, welcome to Lehman College Art Gallery. My name is Deborah Yasinsky, and I'm the curator of education at the gallery. Today, I'd like to welcome you to a public program we're having in conjunction with our current exhibition, Sound Vision, which is all about the relationship between art and music. We're lucky enough today to have Professor David Pearson give us a talk entitled Dystopian Aesthetics and Hardcore Punk. David Pearson is a music historian, saxophonist, composer, and educator. He is an adjunct assistant professor in the music department at Lehman College and earned his PhD in musicology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. As a saxophonist, David has performed modernist and contemporary classical, modal jazz, punk, rap, and more, and currently plays in the Afro-funk band Digital Diaspora. His first book, Rebel Music and the Triumphant Empire, Punk Rock in the 1990s United States, was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor Pearson.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks for bringing me to this series. So what I'm going to be talking about is how dystopian aesthetics find their way into a particular subgenre of punk called extreme hardcore punk. And we've seen more and more artistic production being made, driven really by dystopian aesthetics. This is especially apparent in novels and films when you think about things like The Hunger Games, Children of Men, Black Mirror, and the list goes on. And of course, it's no surprise that we're seeing more and more of this in the last couple decades as our world has started to look more and more dystopian in reality. But what I'm going to talk about specifically is how extreme hardcore punk did this with music, because dystopian aesthetics have been analyzed significantly when it comes to literature, when it comes to film, but how music can sound dystopia has been less considered. So as you can see, just from these three album covers I've got up top here, these are all bands that fit within the extreme hardcore subgenre. These all definitely have a kind of dystopian projection to them. And this was also the case in the lyrics of extreme hardcore punk bands. I've just got a couple different song lyrics here. One by His Hero Is Gone here points to the way that technology can become an effective form of mind control with the words, "They don't even have to break down our doors, blindfolded and gag us with their force, and install mind control devices in our homes. We buy them on our own," right? Which you think about our world today where we've all got the iPhones up to us. This is a rather prescient analysis in 1996. The other lyrics here you can see deal with basically environmental destruction and how this is leading to the earth and humanity's demise. So in a lot of the lyrics of dystopian, extreme hardcore punk, they really dealt with these dystopian themes. But beyond the lyrics, I think one of the main ways that we can really hear dystopia in this is through the musical techniques itself. So what I'm going to be breaking down are the musical techniques of extreme hardcore and how these serve to project dystopia. But before we do that, let's just give a little brief theorization of what dystopian art is, give a little definition of it. And let's turn to two literature scholars to do so. So Frédéric Claes and Pierre Delvin, it's called dystopian art, quote, "the depiction of a dark future based on the systematic amplification of current trends and features. It relates to a complex narrative posture that relies on the critical observation of a threatening present that would lead to an apocalyptic future if nothing were done. Yet, however inescapable this future may be described as, the very existence of such a narrative presupposes that the political community it tries to reach is actually able to do something to thwart it," end quote. So this is a basic definition of dystopian art, this idea of really presenting this strong warning about what could happen if nothing were done. Just to further define that, Another literature scholar, Rob McCallier, points out that dystopian fiction writers use a quote, a fear appeal in an attempt to persuade their readers of the necessity of intervention in the present to avoid the possible horrors of the future, end quote. And the rhetoric of dystopia puts a quote, focus on ethical persuasion that encourages action in an audience, end quote. Thus, dystopian rhetoric relies not on hope, but on, quote, presenting a bleak future world, end quote. And rather than elucidating the means to prevent the impending doomsday scenario, quote, dystopias are an attempt to intercede in history through a warning. And while they may model resistance within the text, they need not do so to argue for intervention, end quote. So I think one thing important about what Rob McCallier is breaking down about dystopia is this fear appeal, this kind of strong sense that this dystopian art promotes in us of really fear of what the future could end up being if we don't do something about it. And this, I think, is what the sounds of extreme hardcore punk do. And they do so through a few specific techniques. One of them is something called the blast beat, which are literally beats at around 800 beats per minute. Typical rock songs are more around the 150 beats per minute range, sometimes slower, sometimes a little faster. Punk music in the late 70s started to take that a little faster, more get to 200 beats per minute. And then hardcore punk in the 80s went up to 300 or even 400 beats per minute. So this really radically changes the rock beat, makes it no longer something where you feel the four distinct beats and tap your foot to them, but something that becomes this really fast whirlwind of speed. And then extreme hardcore punk, which develops in the late 1980s, doubles that tempo to around 800 beats per minute. So speed is very much a part of the aesthetic here. Another technique is that extreme hardcore punk bands, in them, the vocalist tends to scream the lyrics with full-on timbral distortion to their voice, to the point where sometimes it almost sounds like distorted guitar. And so this takes the sort of vocal intensity of punk to an even further level. And then another important musical technique of extreme hardcore punk is that the riffs start to use a lot of melodic dissonances. So in extreme hardcore punk riffs, you will get intervals like tritones and semitones, tritone being really the most dissonant interval or one of the most dissonant intervals possible. And this also takes extreme hardcore punk out of the realm of diatonic and pentatonic scales, which had been the pitch material for most rock and even for most punk up until that point. So a lot more dissonance, screamed vocals, and then much faster drum beats at 800 beats per minute. So what does that wind up sounding like? So let's now turn to an extreme hardcore punk song by the quintessential extreme hardcore band Dropdead from the 1990s. This is a song by theirs called I Will Stand that came out on their 1998 LP. And I've got a transcription here for you, which just transcribes the root motion of the guitar riffs, which are doubled by the bass, and gives the vocals, gives the lyrics in the rhythm that they're screamed at. And then above it, you'll see I've got what the drums are doing, just not notated out, but described. So what the drums do here is a blast beat, what I call an AKS blast beat, which means alternating kick drum and snare drum. That's one type of blast beat. And the tempo is 794 beats per minute. But this really is so fast that it's no longer something you feel as beats in a 4/4 meter. So I call it KSA for kick snare alternation to give a sense of how that tempo really works. So I'm going to press play here, and you can follow along with the transcription. Brace your ears. This is a very loud song, so here we go. So in this example, you can hear those musical techniques I was talking about. The vocals are all out screamed with such a degree of timbral distortion that it almost becomes part of the guitar texture itself. There's the blast beat there that's close to 800 beats per minute. It alternates with a more standard hardcore punk beat for the second verse. And then also, as far as dissonant riffs, you can see that the main riff here, really the main melodic motion in the song, is between a C sharp and a G, which is a tritone apart, that wonderfully dissonant interval. And all this really serves to enunciate, to musically enunciate the lyrical theme of this, that's talking about "I will stand because as Dropdead sees it, humanity is on the verge of extinction and collapse, given where the state of our kind of society is headed." So these are the basic musical techniques of extreme hardcore, which again serve perfectly to deliver these very dystopian warnings of humanity's imminent decline. Um, and this is really corroborated in the record reviews of this music. Punk works by the creation of a whole underground scene that includes independent record labels, underground concert venues, and then also what's called zines, which is just short for fanzines, which are independently produced magazines that talk about everything that's going on in the punk scene, from the music to the politics and everything else. But you can see from these reviews that they really highlight the kind of techniques I was talking about, like this one of an extreme hardcore band called Assuck that calls them energetic, thundering, brain-bruising chaos, triple mile per hour concrete crushing mayhem, capable of reducing nations to cinder. Or another one of the band Dropdead that we just heard that says, quote, they race through 14 speed fests with more fury than Al Unser, who was a race car driver at the time. And then another review, this time of the band Hellnation, that says, a singer who had me checking the turntable speed on several occasions. I don't know how anyone can make their voice do that. So I think these reviews, these all point to the kind of musical techniques I was pointing to. But part of the way they describe them is really being filled with awe. And this is one thing I think about extreme hardcore, is because its musical techniques ratchet up the intensity even of what had been done in punk music prior to that. It really generates this kind of sublime feeling, this feeling of really being in awe of what this music is doing by the sheer extremes of it. But it's a sublime of terror, right? It's this very dystopian sublime, because these musical techniques are, so distorted, so dissonant, and so fast. So in this sense, they become perfect for rendering these dystopian messages. Those, however, are the only techniques we get in extreme hardcore. We also get a sort of opposite version of that that generally gets called the dirge in punk scenes. And the dirge is a type of extreme hardcore that consists of extremely slow tempos. So instead of those fast blast beats, we get extremely slow moving tempos. Dirges tend to use low-pitched growled vocals instead of those more high-pitched screams we heard from Dropdead. Rather than this kind of whirlwind sound, there tends to be an emphasis on every individual musical gesture within the dirge. And another technique that bands playing in the dirge style often do is something called down tuning, where you tune the guitars lower than typical guitar tuning, which gives it not only lower pitch range, but also a kind of darker timbre. So let's now turn to an example of the dirge technique. And this is from the band Burned Up Blood Dry, another extreme hardcore band from the 1990s. This song is called Yesterday's Sorrow, and we're just going to listen to the beginning of it, which is a good example of the dirge. Transcribed here for you is the riff that the guitars and bass are playing. And you can see from the tempo here, 44 beats per minute, that is extremely slow, especially for punk. So here we go. So you can see in the beginning of this song, those dirge techniques I was talking about, the slow tempo, the lower pitched kind of growled vocals, and then also the emphasis on every singular musical gesture. You really hear the motion from one power chord to the next. And finally, for guitar aficionados, you can see that the lowest note here is a D, right? Normally guitars are tuned with the E as their lowest note. So in this example, the guitars have been down tuned to get that kind of darker and lower sonic atmosphere. And so these, even though they're musically somewhat the opposite of what we heard in the Dropdead song, they're kind of other ways of projecting dystopia, right? Other ways of projecting humanity's slow march to potential extinction. And these techniques, and especially the ability to use both of them, both the fast and the slow dirge techniques, were really valued by the people who are into this music. You can see a review of one of this band's records describes good, speedier songs with cohesive guitars and drums, alternating with slower, resonating bouts. Up there with my favorites in this music for the world's coming conflagration, severe pessimism category core. So you can see this value of being able to use all these musical techniques, but also a really hilarious way to describe, to give a sort of genre category to this music, to call attention to how this was really, extremely pessimistic and about the potential end of the world. So now that we've got a kind of background in extreme hardcore punk musical techniques, I just wanted to turn to one last example so we can let it sink in just how deeply this music projected dystopia. And this example comes from a band called His Hero Is Gone, which took these extreme hardcore musical techniques in the 90s and really added whole new layers of complexity to it, especially for punk, and was fittingly described as, by one record reviewer in a punk scene, that their music basically, when Godzilla crushes Tokyo and is busy stomping on buildings, this is what he listens to on his Walkman. So again, this is one of the great things about punk culture, is they have these great ways of using humor to really get at a serious point, namely dystopia here. So let's now turn to His Hero Is Gone song called Chain of Command. As you can see, the lyrics here also have this very dystopian sensibility. In this case, really talking about the way that people tend to follow along blindly with whoever's in charge of them. In this case, they're talking about a boss, and asking really, how long are we going to put up with this? So let's turn to this song. This one is really on the slow end of extreme hardcore. So it doesn't have the speed that we heard from Dropdead. It's not quite as slow as the dirge we heard from Burnt Up Blood Dry, but definitely on the slow end. And after we listen to it, I'll explain some of the musical techniques that were at work that work to really project the dystopia of the lyrics. So here we go. So let's just look at some of the musical techniques we heard in that song and how they really create this musical tapestry of dystopia. So for one thing, the guitars in this have been down tuned all the way down to C. So this is a quite low tuning for guitar. And this is what contributes to this kind of low pitched and very dark sonic atmosphere. Um, at the beginning of that song, we hear a power chord, and a power chord is just consists of a root, a fifth, and an octave. We hear a power chord built from top to bottom, with a guitar playing the top C, then another guitar entering with the G below that, and then the bass finally entering with the C defining that. So this gives it sort of a gravitas right from the beginning. And then we get the bass entering with this first riff, which is in C minor and also contains a very prominent F sharp at the end, which makes a tritone with the root C minor. So we've already got this minor key and then this added dissonance. And on top of that, this riff, above the basic gesture of it is a melodic scent down the C minor scale. And curiously, melodic descents from the root down to the fifth in a minor key had actually been used in Baroque opera as an emblem of lament. So it's kind of interesting that His Hero Is Gone here is doing something that was also done in the Baroque era opera to actually talk about, lament. And in this case, His Hero Is Gone is lamenting dystopia in humanity. So that's the first riff. You can see how that paints this dystopia through this downward melodic descent in a minor key. Then from there, right, we get a move to just an alternation in the bass between a low C and an F sharp. So just outlining a tritone, that dissonant interval. And then the guitars do something very interesting here for punk, which is that they play single notes, not power chords. In punk music, typically guitars mostly stuck to power chords. One guitar plays the pitch G, and then we get another, then it adds the F sharp to that, right? And when we get G and F sharp together, right, we get a very juicy semitone dissonance, which kind of ratchets up the level of dissonance in the song. So you can see that they're using a lot of melodic and harmonic dissonance in this song, not something necessarily so usual in earlier punk. And then finally at the end, we get this last riff, which is this sequence of minor thirds that kind of is this descent into what feels like an oral abyss to me. And then we just get the gesture of two C's with the vocalist growling, "How long?" And that's basically how this song works with all those techniques to project this very dystopian sonic atmosphere. And not surprisingly, the reception to this band, His Hero Is Gone, in punk scenes really spoke to this dystopian atmosphere they created. So one record reviewer in a zine wrote, quote, "tense, churning rhythms that alternate between slow grind and fast hardcore, and the two vocalists unleash some of the most scathing screams around. The lyrics on this complement the music with a dark and depressing feel. They're all about battling against the different levels of confinement that we face every day." And then another reviewer wrote, quote, "lyrically, this record has a political outlook that looks at the subjects with a feeling of helplessness and despair in a somewhat dystopian sort of way," end quote. And then finally, a more critical remark in punk zines on His Hero Is Gone was, quote, "my only criticism is that the words and imagery are so full of bleakness and despair," end quote. So I think you can see from these record reviews in punk scenes that His Hero Is Gone, their musical techniques were really valued or sometimes criticized exactly because they successfully created this feeling of kind of intense misery as if the world's on the verge of dystopia. And so this, of course, was fitting in a lot of ways for extreme hardcore punk bands in the 90s. And I think part of the turn to these dystopian themes was exactly because the 90s was the Clinton era, right? Came after the Reagan era, was the era of kind of official liberal multiculturalism. So to some people, it felt like a sigh of relief. But on a deeper level, of course, there's environmental destruction going on. There's, a growing number of people in prison under the Clinton administration. There's growing devastation, particularly in the third world countries after structural adjustment programs. And of course, there's also, still wars going on in the world. So I think part of what extreme hardcore bands sought to do was actually find a way in that political atmosphere to really sound the warning when it wasn't necessarily being sounded more broadly in society. And just a final word on extreme hardcore punk and these dystopian aesthetics. Often punk is talked about as being this kind of very simple music that any amateur can play. And that's certainly an aspect of punk. But one thing extreme hardcore points out is how punk music has developed in all kinds of different ways over time. The drummer of His Hero Is Gone actually described, quote, "I think it's time for punk to be redefined. It's not just three chords, sound this way and sing about this. I mean, at the time when three chord punk was invented, that wasn't on the radio, and that sounded fucked up compared to what was on the radio. So if that's what's on the radio now, then I think it's time to make it more strange." And I think that's what hardcore was supposed to mean in the first place. It doesn't mean you have to sound a certain way, but it just means taking things to a different level. So this is the other thing extreme hardcore punk shows us, is that punk is by no means just merely simplistic three chord music. A whole lot of different musical techniques and styles have come about through the course of punk's history. And often those techniques are put in service of expressing an important political message, such as the dystopian warnings we get in extreme hardcore punk. So that's just a little bit on extreme hardcore punk. There's a lot more we could explore about this subgenre, but I'll leave it there. And of course, you can check out my book if you want to learn more. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I had a few questions.
Sure.
First, I was really interested in the use of zines, and especially in relationship to our current exhibition, which is kind of combining music and art genres. Was there a lot of illustrations or art within the zines in the extreme hardcore movement, or was it more text based?
Yeah, both I would say. Definitely plenty of text, often zines packed in a lot of text, but punk has always had a very artistic sensibility. A lot of visual artists were involved with punk from the beginnings, and I think punk also developed its own kind of visual aesthetic. So zine covers would often be very creatively done, and then within the pages of zines, you would get art, you would get photography, you would get album covers. So definitely a combination of both. And some zines were even created that were more art than text, more photography than text. So definitely an outlet for that.
And did you see that idea of distortion that you see in the music and vocals? Did you see that in the art as well?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Number one, a lot of punk art was silkscreen. So if you even look at this guy's T-shirt here, it's silkscreen. So often the quality of that is going to be a little distorted from the get-go. But often I think punk visual art, and I'm by no means an expert on visual art, but I think often it would be fairly busy, so a lot going on in it, and also try to sort of capture the feel as though it's been photocopied several times over, which
Yeah,
often things were. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I was wondering, I mean, I don't know when you completed the writing portion of the book, but certainly we're in a time now that people feel that is dystopian, right? I mean, and you couldn't have sort of predicted or where we were at when you sort of completed and were relating it, but would you kind of have a different lens now? Is it just more of a continuation sort of what you were seeing of the ideas? Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think on one level it's a continuation in that a lot of, and this I think is one of the noteworthy things about extreme hardcore punk in the 90s, is it's actually singing about a lot of things that are more prevalent now back then. So whether it was the environment, whether it was the rise of the Christian right, whether it was the way technology was kind of, in some ways taking over our culture and making people glued to constant messaging. So it was definitely ahead of the curve. And I think we've seen these things, a lot of the things that extreme hardcore punk was talking about, accelerate, go to new extremes. of course, the far right also had a big resurgence, and punk music has always had, there's always been a lot of struggle against the far right within punk.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things are continuations. On the other hand, I think there's a question of a breaking point, right? And whether we've maybe reached a breaking point, whether kind of Trump's presidency pushed the far right into a just much greater emboldened position, how long we have to kind of stave off environmental destruction is a very real question. And then, of course, COVID just revealed, how incapable our healthcare system is, how incapable our social system is of dealing with something like that. So I think there's new things and acceleration at the same time. And I think it makes this music extremely relevant in hindsight in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's prophetic, right? Unfortunately so. And I was wondering how you sort of came to be interested in this particular area of EHC and sort of the dystopian view.
Yeah. So I set about to write what's basically a history of 90s punk in the US, especially the more political end of that. So my book doesn't cover every aspect of punk, every subgenre, but definitely the more political end of the music. And I think there's several several kind of subgenres of punk that were prominent in the 90s, and extreme hardcore was one of them. And I think what fascinated me about extreme hardcore in particular was how it pushed the music to new extremes. Because already when you go back to punk in the early 80s, you've got 400 beats per minute tempos, you've got singers yelling. And I think one of the interesting things about punk is that throughout its history, there's always been this trend of trying to push it to new extremes. So I wanted to understand that. And I think doing a lot of transcription of the music helped identify the musical techniques that do that. And then seeing what people are writing about it in zines helped to kind of understand how people were thinking about this music, how they were commenting on the techniques. So that was part of it. But I think also just being aware of, how dystopia has become such a more prominent theme in all kinds of different artistic spheres, exactly because it's more and more of our reality. But music that is dystopian hasn't actually been written about, so I really wanted to take a chance to consider, how musical sounds themselves can project dystopia.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just one last thought, and I don't know, if obviously production and musicians aren't performing now, but if you're seeing a shift um, in the scene now, and you spoke a little bit about this, the acceleration perhaps, but I was wondering even if there's something more, even more so that you're seeing being addressed because of sort of the current situation.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure there's been a new subgenre of punk that's more intense. I'm not sure if that's possible. I think extreme hardcore punk might have, pushed it to the furthest boundary.
Right.
Um, but definitely punk is always kind of changing. I think what we've seen more in the last 10 or 20 years of punk is that more of the subgenre boundaries are breaking down. So bands will kind of use some elements of extreme hardcore punk, maybe mix that with some more melodic styles and some other styles. So it's maybe a way of dealing with, figuring out how to express a broader range of political topics and emotions in the music. But there's certainly still extreme hardcore punk is still a genre in existence. There's still bands making music like that. The band Dropdead, who we heard first, is actually still in existence, still touring. So unfortunately, it is still very relevant. I'm not sure there's been a music that's more dystopian than this. I look forward to hearing other people's views on that for sure. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I really want to thank you. This has been a wonderful sort of education for people who may not be familiar with extreme hardcore, punk, and generally punk in general. I think, you know, looking at it as a musician and, you know, kind of looking at the lyrics, but as well as the musical composition is really enlightening. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, bye.